All right, people are joining in now. We'll get started in just a second. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in the Solutions at Scale virtual education series. My name is Rachel. I'm the Environmental Education Coordinator at Reforest London, and I currently work at the Reforest office located at the Westminster Pond Centre in London, Ontario, which is being developed as London's first Centre for Environment and Sustainability. We are excited to have you be a part of this webinar series focused on getting to know your green space and building towards our virtual conference taking place March 26th and 27th with the theme of overcoming challenges in urban forestry. So a special thanks to the Natural Resources Canada for our 2 billion trees funding, enabling us to run this virtual education series and other projects here at the Westminster Pond Centre. Before we begin, I have a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that I'm situated on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape peoples, nations which have longstanding relationships with the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. We extend our recognition to the neighboring First Nations communities, Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, who continue to steward the land today. We recognize the treaties of this area, such as the London Township Treaty of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum, among others, which have influenced the history of relationships between settlers and Indigenous people. As we're all treaty people, we should take the time to learn about contemporary and present stewards of the lands we call home as we work towards reconciliation. So on that note, I'm so excited to have Payton Lansborough here. Welcome to our virtual stage of sorts. If you don't already know, Payton is the Stewardship and Outreach Coordinator at Thames Talbot Land Trust. She is FGCA certified to be a seed collector and a native plant enthusiast. In her free time, Payton can be found gardening or crouched on the forest floor, surrounded by field guides. So before I hand it over to you, Payton, we're so excited to have you here. I just wanted to say that we will be ending this presentation with a Q&A. So please save your questions until the end or put them in the chat throughout. Feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, maybe let us know where you're zooming in from. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded, as you likely saw when you entered, though as attendees, your name, photo, and video of you will not be shared by us to protect your privacy. So thanks so much. I'll hand it over to you, Payton. I'm just going to unspotlight myself and we can get started.
Well, thanks for introducing me, Rachel. And just want to tell everyone to just bear with me a little bit. I'm more accustomed to having a live studio audience rather than being on camera, but I'll do my best. So today I'm here to talk about broadcasting the seeds of restoration. And let me just see if I can, we're fine. Just a little bit of delay. Again, as Rachel mentioned, I am the Stewardship and Outreach Coordinator at Thames Talbot Land Trust, which for those that don't know, we're an environmental charity based in London, Ontario, and we operate within Elgin, Middlesex, Oxford, and Perth counties. So essentially what we do is just we protect land, we restore land, and we just want to have a healthy environment. There's a little delay for me on the screen. That's fine. Oh, I have to double click. Okay, so this is our operating area. We have about 26 nature reserves within these 4 counties that are all greened out. And yeah, into the main part of the presentation. So I want to do a little quick overview of what a native plant is, because this can be a little bit of a more controversial term, which may not often be thought of, but it's really important when we're thinking about the context of seed collection and restoration in general. And so again, this can be a little bit controversial, but it usually refers to the plants that were growing in Ontario prior to European contact and colonization, but it is also a scale and location dependent term. And so essentially, these are the plants that are recolonizing the area following post-glacial migration. And so this is when the glaciers were covering the land and then retreated about 12,000 years ago. And slowly plants have been making their way up back into this area. And this process was disrupted by colonization. And so one thing that I kind of want people to reflect on is how specific should we be about what a native plant is? Specifically, should we consider plants to be non-native if they're growing naturally in Windsor, Ontario? Not in Windsor, in Detroit, Michigan, but were not growing in Windsor, Ontario prior to colonization. Just something to reflect on. And specifically, the plant that I'm referring to is the foxglove beard tongue that is pictured here. So in the botany community, this plant is a little bit controversial. A lot of folks think that it is non-native. A lot of folks think that it's native. And again, it can be controversial. We can never truly know. But to me, I think I treat this plant as native. It has so many benefits. And that is in part because native plants and the near native plants sustain really complex and intricate relationships within the local environment because they've co-adapted and evolved with other species for millennia. And so this also, for the native definition, it also will include species that have spread through traditional Indigenous land stewardship practices and food systems. And a good example of that one would actually be the pawpaw. And so when we're talking about near native, which is a term that is gaining more popularity, this would be more of the species that they didn't quite make it into Ontario prior to colonization, but they are native to the Great Lakes Basin. And again, this is gaining popularity. Now, when we're thinking of other things like the non-native or introduced, again, this can be scale and location dependent. Something can be, when you're looking at more of like a county scale, something can be introduced to a county, but native to the province. Or you can have something from Europe that is entirely introduced to the continent. So it's a little bit more of a nuanced thing, but typically when we use this term, we're referring to the species that did not occur in that geographic region prior to Europeans arriving. And when we're reflecting on something like wildflower or naturalized, wildflowers are just the plants that grow wild. No human intervention involved. It can be native or non-native. It doesn't have much nuance for that. Whereas naturalized, often we kind of see the logical fallacy of the appeal to nature, which is where we think of something as something with the word nature or natural in it as something that is inherently positive. But in reality, naturalized is just a neutral term. All that it means is that these non-native plants are capable of successfully reproducing in the wild without human assistance. They don't become native over time, and invasive species are actually a subset of naturalized plants. So invasive, this is a legal term in Ontario, and it refers to the harmful introduced species that their spread either threatens the economy, the environment, or society. And when we're thinking of the ecological effects, often these impacts are irreversible. And it can also sometimes refer to native plants that can negatively impact all of those three features, in part due to their unprecedented spread caused by human activities and so forth. And so one that we can often think of in this context is Manitoba maple. I personally love it, but a lot of people have problems with it because it sometimes grows in the wrong place for what someone is wanting. And usually when I'm reflecting on native plants that some gardeners may refer to as invasive, I prefer to use the term aggressive. So aggressive can refer to native or non-native plants, but these are just the plants that are capable of spreading rapidly or opportunistically, and they also have a tendency to alter the site conditions to suit their needs, and they can actually shift the ecosystem type. So a good example of that would be wild grape. And again, these can be native or non-native. And the final term for this is going to be noxious weed. So this is another legal term. It's an agricultural term, and it's regulated by the Ontario Weed Control Act. And these are going to be the species that historically common milkweed used to be one of these noxious weeds, but luckily we've come to realize how important this plant is and have removed it from that list. So I mentioned what they are, so now I want to talk about why. And so again, these are the plants that provide the foundation for a functional ecosystem. They support a wide variety of complex interactions. They provide food, shelter for insects, wildlife, and people. And when you're cultivating them, they don't require as much input. Like, you don't need to fertilize or absolutely baby it. It's not like a cultivated rose where if you look at it wrong, it'll die. These are tough plants. And something that I find neat simply about the pictures on here is that every single plant in this photo is edible with the right preparation, even though we typically only think about the black caps or the black raspberries, depending on where you're from, as the edible thing. But they're all good plants, loved by wildlife. So another key factor in thinking of why we want to plant native plants and restore with native plants is thinking about how much they benefit the environment around them. And so one type of plant that is in particular extremely important are the keystone plants. These are the plants that they support the highest level of complexity. They support so many different species. So 90% of terrestrial birds in North America, they depend on the insects that are supported by keystones. And so this could include 75 to 90% of Lepidoptera. So those are your moths, your butterflies, your skippers. And there's also a lot of pollen specialist bees that rely on keystones in some part of their life cycle to actually raise their young. And so these are the species that are the most important in the ecosystem. So this is just the numbers that we see for butterflies or Lepidoptera hosted by the goldenrods, the oaks, the blueberries, and what sort of pollen specialist bees are hosted by the goldenrods and the blueberries. We don't really get pollen specialist bees for oak trees because they are wind pollinated. So another reason why we'd want to choose native plants is because just like the horticultural plants that we're so accustomed to, they come in all different types of growing types and life cycles. So we can have the annuals, biennials, the perennials. And this just means that these species are capable of occupying any sort of niche or any sort of stage within succession. And so when we're adding things like the annuals, that they complete their growing cycle within 1 year, these are actually typically already in people's soils. So I personally have some native annuals that were just growing as weeds in my vegetable garden that once I realized what they were, I started to leave them. They're keeping out the invasives and they're keeping out the stuff that I don't want. Likewise, biennials are in that similar situation, and they typically complete their life cycles 2 to 3 years. Again, typically already in that seed bank. And just like the annuals, they emerge with disturbance. And having both the annuals and the biennials in your seed mix or in your planting plan allows for something beneficial to be occupying and growing in the space while your slow growing perennials are slowly growing, slowly maturing, which once they're in there, they'll continue growing year to year. Typically, you don't need to replant them, and they're long lasting and low maintenance. So let's get into the seeds portion. So one thing that we want to keep in mind with when we're working to collect seeds, because you can't have any sort of seed-based restoration without the seeds. They are one of the most crucial components. And so something that we need to keep in mind is, what is the dispersal strategy used by that plant? Because that's going to have a big influence on how you go about collecting the seeds. And so in the context of this jewel weed that is happily growing in my garden, this is going to be one that is a ballistic seed dispersal, which means they can actually be kind of tricky to collect. And in addition to this, the seed pods can also, the seeds can actually float. to some degree, allowing them to have multiple dispersal strategies. And again, this isn't like plants aren't restricted to one dispersal strategy. Nothing in life is going to be that simple. But inherently, when we're thinking about these, we're wanting to think of like, if it's animal distributed, is it consumed or is it going to attach itself to the fur? Because that's going to change your strategy for how you collect and how you process it. Are the seeds wind? So orchids, for example, a lot of their seeds are wind dispersed. You have to be very, not even like, you have to be very particular about collecting them, and that's not even getting into actually getting them to germinate. The water dispersed seeds, they're going to typically float. So you wouldn't really be able to test their viability through float tests because they're all going to float. And then when you think of the things that are gravity dispersed, that's going to be your apple. Typically, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. They're going to be the things that grow nice and close, or like fall nice and close to the parent plant. And so again, seed dispersal, that impacts the timing and the methods for collection and processing. And dispersal strategy is largely influenced, or you can get an idea of what the dispersal strategy of the plant is by the seed type. And this can depend on the species. It can even depend on the high-level family. But essentially, the species, the seed type, and dispersal, they all influence that collection, storage, and propagation piece. And we have a wide variety of different dispersal mechanisms and seed types, all just in this image. Forecasting. Woo. So essentially, seed forecasting, it's going to come down to understanding the plant's reproductive cycle in order to know when that seed will actually be produced and if it will be produced that year. And so just like some common ideas is that like cycle lengths, they vary among the species. When you're looking even at like, different species within the same genus, like the oaks, the red oak group, they take 27 months between flowering and ripe acorns, whereas the white oaks, they're going to be 17 months. But when you're looking at things that are herbaceous in nature, like most prairie forbs, the seeds are going to be ready 6 to 8 weeks after. And then spring ephemerals, they are really tricky to time, but the seeds will typically be ready 4 to 6 weeks after flowering, but they don't always produce viable seed. So essentially just seed forecasting is like the process for tracking and monitoring flowering period, the seed development, maturity, and seed quality of your target species in order to know when and how to collect. And so this comes down to phenology. So that's really timing the life cycle. Phenology is the timing of the biological life cycle and how the environment influences like the timing of those events. And each life cycle stage is known as a phenophase. And so some of the typical ones that we'd expect in a plant life cycle would be bud burst, the first flower, last flower, when you first get some ripe fruit, when it's at peak, and then when the leaves are shedding. There's many more than that, essentially depending on, you can also almost make infinite phenophases, essentially, depending on what specific thing or what specific portion of the life cycle you're looking for. But these are just some examples, and the plant phenology, specifically of the flowering time and the fruit ripeness, is going to impact and inform the timing of seed collection. But the one thing that makes it a little bit tricky about seed forecasting is that the data that you need to do this effectively and strategically is not always easy to access. It can actually be really difficult to access for herbaceous plants. With woody trees, shrubs, and vines, the Forest Gene Conservation Association, the FGCA, has made it really easy. Their Seeds of Ontario Trees and Shrubs Field Manual, I love it. It is really great. They have a calendar, essentially, that blocks out different months based on when you should be forecasting, when it's the really critical, important time for forecasting, and when you should be collecting. And they give enough variation in the number of months so then you can tailor it in with your own observation to be able to figure it out for your specific geographic region. But that sort of information is not accessible in one centralized location for herbaceous species. And so often this requires people to have their personal data tracking and species research tools and information available to them. I'm sure all seed collectors have some form of spreadsheet or database that they use to ensure they're, keeping that information straight. I know that some of my friends, we actually joke about when we'll see our first flower of a specific species or so forth. It's always a little bit of a game to see how early we are to find these. And it's a little nerdy thing that's quite fun. But some resources that you can use for those herbaceous species to kind of fill in the gaps are the Minnesota Wildflowers What's in Bloom page. So this one is really nice because it breaks it down by month and will give you a range, and you can look at it for both native species and also invasive or non-native species, for just in case you want to make sure that you're not entering into, for example, a dog strangling vine patch and accidentally distributing seeds. So it's kind of useful for that, and we have a fairly similar timing for flowering as Minnesota, which makes it pretty good, and we have considerable species overlap. Another one that I kind of recommend would be the Native Plant Database for Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. So this one has some info about like the flowering period, the seed collection, what propagation methods you would use, what the growing conditions are, what's the distribution and range. But one caveat for this is that this resource is based out of Texas. And so when you're looking at the timing that they talk about, it's going to reflect that longer growing period that we just don't have here. And there could be some nuances that are more specific to the US, or they may not have all the information we need for Ontario. And I know this was the second one that I have written down, but the Identify page on iNaturalist, I really like that one, so long as the information is available. So when you go to the Identify page and you need an iNaturalist account to do this, you can actually search the species that you're looking for, and there will be a More Filters section once you press the filters, but there will be a More Filters section, and you can actually use the annotation of plant phenology and base it around when the flowering period is, the fruiting period, so forth. For some species, this is really effective because you can even, on the map stage at least, you can look at like what the trends are for your specific county. But the one caveat for this is that not everyone actually fills out that information when they're submitting observations to iNaturalist. And so some species have considerable data gaps. But it works really well for Sambucus, which is the elderberry genus. For the collection, I'm going to just take a sip of water. So a critical portion of seed collection is that timing, which I alluded to or really extensively mentioned in that forecasting section. But essentially, for timing seed collection, when we're looking at the visual cues, mature seeds are going to tend to be, they're going to be firm, they're going to be dry, and they're going to be fairly dark in color. And when cut, the inside will be white or creamy colored, and it'll mostly fill the seed cavity. And so there's a variety of maturity tests that you can do that it'll be a little bit different for different species and different seed types. So some general things is looking at the color. So ripe fleshy fruit, you're going to have a tendency to have ripe fruit be like red or purple blue, or in the case of dogwoods, they're going to be white. But that will just be the flesh. The seeds inside are going to be darker in color, and they're going to be fairly firm. And again, they're going to be creamy colored on the inside. And then when you're doing stuff for like seed heads, yeah, when you're looking at the color for like seed heads and pods and sheaths, this will be when they start to yellow or turn brown. The one exception to that would be actually your sedges, because sedges are really difficult to time for most species. They're actually going to be a little bit green on their outer sheaths. Another thing that you can do is cut tests, which again, you're going to be trying to look at, you're just cutting the seeds in half, and you're going to be looking at like the flesh color, the presence of any insect damage. Is like the seed cavity 90 to 100% full? And when reviewing the FGCA field manual, it mentions something like 10 samples per individual is what's recommended. I'm also thinking I remember something about 10%, but I'd have to review my notes. Another thing that we can also do is float test, but this is very taxa dependent. So this will work for the nuts, so like the oaks, the hickories, the walnuts, and the beech, but it won't work for a variety of other species. And so this will be when, like, typically the viable seeds will sink, except for if there's major holes that are just getting inundated with water. But some of the floaters may actually be viable, but just a little bit dehydrated. So you should definitely cut some of those to make sure. Oops. Oh, I can't go backwards. Rachel, would you be able to go to the thank you so much. Some general rules for seed collection is that, like, the seed pods, they're the ones that are wind dispersed, they'll be ready when the pods have dried out, they've darkened a bit, and they've started to just open a bit. Something that you can think of as a milkweed pod. When they start to crack, the seeds are good. For the ballistic dispersal, those explosive ones, they can be really difficult to collect. And so you have to really closely watch for any color changes. And something that I find helpful for some ballistic dispersed seed pods, such as like wild geranium, is actually tying a small little muslin or cloth bag around the seed pods when they're just starting to yellow, because when they start to dry out a bit, they'll actually explode into that little bag, and it makes it so much easier. Because those things they can go far. They're projectiles. And for the seed heads, those are going to be such as like your cone flowers and sunflowers, that sort of thing. Those are going to be ready typically when the petals are gone. The seed head is dry and you can easily rub or shake the seeds out. Grasses, they're super easy. You just run your hand along the stem and the seeds will just fall into your hand. Nice and simple. And then again, the fleshy fruit, that's going to be when the fruit is plump and deep in color and the seeds are dark, firm, and full. So TTLT primarily does a collection of meadow seeds and a little bit of the forest grasses and aster family members. But when we're collecting seeds for these meadow environments, it's really easy. It's low equipment needs. You really just need some like clippers, maybe some paper bags or buckets, just some sort of container, and then some pens to make sure that you're making note of where you collect it, when you collect it, and what you've collected. It's really important that you keep track of that information, so then you don't get stuck later on being like, oh my God, where did I collect this? What is this? Do I have to like completely pore over books to figure out what is going on? And so typically you just cut the seed heads or the pods, drop them into the bucket. For grasses, you run your hand along the stems. And then for the meadow seeds, you're able to put these into paper bags and allow them to dry in a cool, dark place or on sheets of newspaper for about 2 weeks before you think of long-term storage. So just so then everyone can know, seed collection, you have to make sure that you have permission for when you're collecting at a location. So if you're in a natural space that is local to you, make sure you have permission from the landowner. Don't collect from conservation areas, provincial parks, anywhere that is considered a protected area. There's typically some permitting processes that you need to go through to have access to those locations. But if you're local to TTLT, we have 2 wildflower gardens that are open to the public, and people can come and collect seeds from them whenever. One is at Hawkcliffe Woods and the other is at Wardsville Woods. And we also allow for seed collection on some of our other properties. You just have to, send us an email, ask us, and we'll meet you out on the land and go on a little nice hike. For the processing. So I will specify that this will be exclusive to dry seeds. This is not going to be talking about the fleshy fruits because they are more complicated and too much. I'm not into that yet. Maybe one day in the future. But when you're doing some seed cleaning for the drier seeds, there's 3 basic methods, which is your threshing, your screening, and your winnowing. And so when you're threshing, this is just when you're trying to knock the seeds from the plant material. And there can be 3 main approaches where it's like the stomp method, the shake method, and the screen method, which fresh screening is different than screening as a cleaning practice. Slightly different. In that more specific screening practice, that's going to be when you're sifting the seeds from the coarse plant material. And then the finer the plant material, the more intensive you have to go. And so that will bring you into that winnowing stage where you're using airflow as a means to sort the seeds from the fine plant material. And so the benefit to cleaning seeds is that it actually extends the viability so long as you're doing proper storage methods. So with threshing, that stomp threshing method, that one can be pretty fun. So it's typically used for those large seed heads, like those coneflowers or the plants with like hard shells, like the hard shells for the pods, such as like the beard tongues. And so those are typically where you're going to be like, gently stomping or crushing with like a rolling pin or meat tenderizer, making sure you have a space that the seeds are collecting. And then, you can sometimes follow it up with shaking afterwards if it's needed. With shaking, that's going to be just like putting things into a little Tupperware. And it's like those small seed heads, those capsules, those pods, not the ones with the hard shells, but you just like shake them about and it loosens the seeds. It's really effective. And then the screening, this is going to be for your fluffies, like your asters, your goldenrods. You want to do this outdoors in a well-ventilated area, ideally with masks. The pappus, the fluffy part of aster family plants, is a major irritant. It can be breathed in and it's not a fun time. And so when you're doing the screening, you rub the fluffy seed heads over a mesh screen or above sieves, above a container to loosen the seeds from the fluff. Or you can actually get a little bit creative where you can put a few, like a tennis ball or 2 in a bucket that has a lid, and then you can just like roll it around and it'll separate it. Or you can use like a rock tumbler or a concrete mixer, again with those tennis ball practices, and like it'll loosen the seeds from the fluff, and then you just pour it over a mesh screen. It's not going to be perfect, but it's much better than having to like meticulously pick off the tiny little fluffs from each seed. Like no one has time for that. We typically don't actually bother to do this. We use our seeds well enough, like soon enough at TTLT that we're not doing that long-term storage, that we're able to just like disperse the seeds where we want them. But if you're wanting to do that long-term storage and play around with fluffy seeds. So storage, just the basics. Something that is good to keep in mind is that seeds are typically described by their ability to tolerate freezing and desiccation, which desiccation, that's the drying out. So there's 3 main categories, which is the orthodox, recalcitrant, and intermediate. The orthodox, those are going to be the species and the seeds that tolerate drying to about 15–20% relative humidity, and they can be frozen at -20 degrees Celsius for long-term storage. Recalcitrant, they do not tolerate freezing or desiccation. It will actually cause the water within their cells to turn into ice and break their their cell walls, and they can't be really stored long term. There might be some like specific practices that you can do to extend the life, but that's a bit beyond my knowledge. And for the intermediate, these are the species that can somewhat tolerate drying and freezing. They can be stored for a shorter period, maybe up to 5 years at -20 with like 45 to 65% relative humidity. They're not going to be as shelf stable, I suppose, as orthodox seeds, but it's kind of intermediate. And so even when we're not thinking about the long-term storage side of things, we can also just refrigerate the seeds to extend the seed viability. And something to just keep in mind is that recalcitrant seeds, again, they must be kept moist, and that will be your oats. So if we're not thinking about the storage, but we are thinking about like, I want to get these plants in the ground, like I want to get these seeds started, let's go. We have to think about seed treatments. We have to think of how do we break the dormancy and trigger the seed germination. And so luckily for us, Prairie Moon Nursery has determined the seed treatments for a wide variety of native plant species and has developed 16 germination codes that we can use, with the most common ones being cold moist stratification, which I'm sure many people have heard of. You also have your cold dry storage, which is just, it's no pre-treatment. You just cool, dark place, you're fine. Maybe a garage. And then another one that's pretty common is when the seeds need very small, they're very small and they need light to germinate, or they can't tolerate being submerged under soil. So they need to be sprinkled at the top. And so a list of native plants and their associated seed treatments can actually be found online as a single PDF that was co-created by Prairie Moon and Lake to Prairie. I can send the link off to Rachel so then she can share it. But something that we should keep in mind is that seed treatments aren't known for all native plants. Like there is a huge world to explore when it concerns breaking the dormancy of native plant species. There's a lot of exciting things for that. So going back into the stratification portion. So again, that cold dry storage, just leave them in the fridge or like a garage. You don't really have to do much other than cleaning them. But with the cold moist stratification, this is when you're going to be putting them in like damp sand or a vermiculite sand mixture, and you're going to put them in the fridge in like a Ziploc bag or a container or something. And if it's like really small amounts, just like put them in a damp paper towel or coffee filter in a Ziploc bag, and this will be able to trigger germination once they've fulfilled their cold stratification period. And so a common time frame is 60 days, so 2 months, but anywhere from 10 to 100 days, 120 days is possible. And one thing that is a little bit trickier is when you're dealing with those woodland plants, those spring ephemerals, because sometimes those can actually require alternating periods of cold moist stratification and warm moist stratification. They need to experience a winter, summer, winter in order to germinate, possibly germinate, really. Yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind. If you don't have a lot of fridge space and you also don't want to have to keep track of a bunch of bags of seeds, you can do winter sowing instead. And so this is just, realistically TTLT for most, if not all of our restorations. We do winter sowing. We just broadcast the seeds in the places that we want them to go. And so this is an alternative to indoor seed stratification. You can either direct sow in the garden or in your restoration area, or you can sow in pots, plastic jugs, or pop bottles. Kind of fun. There's a lot of benefits. More fridge space. You don't really, if you're direct sowing, you don't have to dig. It's not as labor intensive. There's also a lower risk for dampening off of seedlings, which is a very challenging thing for if you've started your plants indoors, you're all excited, you bring them, and then like you realize that you didn't do the perfect watering, and so then they all die. Very disappointing. It's also really hands-off after the initial seeding, and you also get the benefit of surprise plants if you completely forgot about doing it, which that's always a fun thing. The one thing is that sometimes that's not the most effective means for your purposes. So if you really want to have high confidence in your seedling ID, you're going to want to lean towards that indoor stratification because you have that control. You don't have that possibility of outside plants seeding into the same area. You also will reduce the impacts of predation. So when you direct sow, you have a risk of, for example, for really small seeds, earthworms will actually eat the seeds and then drag them deep into the ground beyond where they can actually germinate effectively. And so that's a concern. You can also kind of accelerate the germination of double dormant seed plants. Instead of having to wait a full year plus to be able to germinate a woodland plant, you can have those periods be back to back and really condense it, which is pretty nice. It also allows you to have the established plants for if you're doing any sort of spring planting activities, whether or not it's like, you want to have started plants for around a wetland, or you're wanting to sell some of the plants. It's the benefit of indoor stratification. But when we're talking about what we do, the restoration portion, we do it from seeds. It's hands off. We toss the seeds out there. And so one of the main benefits and the purposes of seed-based restoration is, or I guess, yeah, the main purpose of seed-based restoration is going to be that habitat creation or habitat enhancement. So it can be a situation where you're wanting to just completely create new habitats to increase the biodiversity, or maybe transition marginal lands away from, let's say, a flooded farm field into a nice new wetland, something that's providing more benefits. Or maybe you're wanting to, in the habitat enhancement portion, you're wanting to just like overseed over existing or degraded habitats to just increase that biodiversity and just, make more plants to grow more plants, essentially. And so some of the key benefits of restoration at seed is that it can be done at any scale. So we, at TTLT, we have a project that's coming up at Hawk Cliff. We have our expansion project, and I think we have something like, 25 hectares that we will be restoring in the next couple of years. And so that's huge. It's, it's one of the benefits of at seed. You don't have to like plant every single individual plant. You can just broadcast the seeds, whether or not with machinery or with hands. And so this can actually reduce the cost and be more efficient than planting those individual plants. And the benefit is when you have diverse seed mixes, it allows for a natural filtering process for species establishment. Instead of having to like be very specific about the replacement of each individual plug, it just, if the plant doesn't want to grow there because it's too dry or too much clay, it just won't grow there, but something else will. And it's really helpful for that. And another thing is that seasonal precipitation it's enough to make most species germinate. You don't really need to irrigate, unlike when you're planting plugs and dealing with that transplant shock. But something that is really crucial to ensure that there's success is preparing the site. If you don't do good site preparation, you're not going to have a lot of success. You're going to be overwhelmed with weeds, maybe things like Canada thistle, which are really difficult to get rid of. And the initial condition of your site is really going to impact the success and the end result of your restoration. And so typically annual crop fields, they're much easier to restore than a fallow field that has a lot of weed species, or a hay field that has a lot of pasture legumes and cool season grasses, which are really competitive. And so site prep can actually be a multi-year project because exhausting the seed bank can be a major challenge. And just a final slide, just thinking of an example, or like demonstrating an example of some habitat creation that TTLT has done from seed-based restoration is our property Beavency Tract. And so this used to be, there's a small cutout in a forest that used to be an agricultural field. And we use primarily seeds to restore the area, with a few specific monitoring plots where we had plugs. But the vast majority is all seeds, and we can see that there's a nice diversity of species. It was very colorful this just in 2022 with all the flowers, and yeah. That is all. Thank you.
All right. I think I've stopped sharing my screen now. So thank you so much, Peyton. Um, Wait, I'm going to spotlight myself as well. Where are we here? On spotlight. All right, so I'm just going to look in the chat and pull up some of the questions that we might have from our participants. I know I certainly have a couple questions for you. We have our hellos. Margaret is wondering where we can find a list of keystone species per region. Nathan provided a list from NWF.
Yeah, that's the list I
For
use too.
Okay, perfect. We have a question from Sandy. Could you recommend the 5 easiest species to broadcast, or even the top 10? What are your favorite species to broadcast?
I personally love the asters. I have some major aster biases just because they are like with the goldenrods and the asters, they are the top 2 herbaceous plants for supporting wildlife. So, and they're also pretty easy. They're fluffy. You just pull from the plant and then ooh, floof. There's like 30 species of goldenrod. So I feel like that already does that. But other than that, I would really focus on doing some form of diversity. So something that I personally like to do to get my annuals, I would do something like Black-Eyed Susan, Rudbeckia hirta, would also do something like evening primrose, Onianthera biennis, which is a biannual. So you get those 2 intermediate stages, and then throw in some stuff like bee balm, which is just nice little nectar plant. Throw in your asters, maybe some sort of native sunflower or sweet oxeye. They all grow really well from
Amazing.
seed.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a pretty good list to start if not to continue on. I have another question from Rosemary. She's asking, is it too late to winter seed now in jars, potentially?
It depends on the species. So if you're doing anything like, I'm trying to think of some really, actually, I'm going to switch my direction. So some things that you would be able to do now are things like golden alexanders, wild rye, any of the native grasses, wild bergamot, Virginia mountain mint. All of those are still able to be winter sown right now. They actually don't typically require that much pre-treatment. Same with all the milkweed species. They can all be planted into pots right now and you will have success. Just be mindful that they might be slow. You might be looking at them in May being like, oh my God, are these going to sprout? And they may not sprout till June.
Yeah, no, thanks. We have a question from Nathan, from Kingston, Ontario. In urban lawn regeneration projects, what would you suggest as a good land prep process?
So there's a few methods and like some different considerations there. Essentially, you want to make sure that you're getting rid of the grass. The cool season lawn grasses, they are extremely competitive. Their roots form dense mats. You want to get rid of them. So you can either use, I don't really like tilling, but you can do some sort of rototiller and be able to kind of stuff it out. You can also do something like lasagna gardening, but you have to be careful because not everyone wants cardboard in their garden because it does have some chemicals in it. But that's essentially where you're laying something like cardboard or newspaper, you throw some mulch on there and then you put soil on top, or maybe even leaves instead of mulch, just something that smothers out the grass, and you can either plant directly on there. Something that I've actually done is just like pile a huge dense layer of grass and then like put a bunch of soil on top and just plant it plugs directly in there. But that was on a smaller scale. You could also get a, what is the word I'm thinking of? Like it's a turf remover, essentially. It just scrapes off the top layer of turf. There's a different name for it that's escaping me right now, but I did that in my front yard. The one caveat with that is that urban areas have really compacted soil. And especially if you're in a shallower soil area like Kingston, you want to try preserving as much top soil as you can in it. So if you can compost that grass to be able to add on afterwards, it's better. But there's a variety of methods.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's great. And I definitely not like beyond prairie restoration as well, and in reforest preparation for various sites across the city. We've used the cardboard. We're definitely trying to improve the soil conditions in places where it's really compacted. So I can kind of second that.
Yeah.
Nathan
Aeration's
followed
good.
up. Yeah, definitely. Followed up with a question. Do you know where I can obtain or gather seed for Calencia verna, blue-eyed Mary?
No, unfortunately, no.
Next question, will milkweed sow with broadcasting?
Easily, very easily. Just want to make sure you're matching the species with your soil conditions. So you wouldn't want to put butterfly milkweed, the orange one, in an area with high clay content, but swamp milkweed will do fine there.
Great. I have a couple more questions. Still good to go? All right, perfect. So I have a question from El Sabe. Any recommendations on native plants that will push out ivy and vinca?
Ooh, that's tricky. That's so tricky because they require so much management just because the vines root where they touch the ground too. And so something that I'm battling vinca in my backyard. So I try to get out there to actually like hand pull as much vinca as possible, about like twice a year, ideally. But I have been slowly adding things like the wild bergamot. I've also added like shrubs. I can't say it's super successful, but I essentially anything that has a really competitive root system, like your native mints, your native sunflowers, if they're shade tolerant in that area, if it's a part shade spot, you can try putting them in there and really like planting as densely as possible. It won't eradicate, but it will improve, and then you'll still have to have that ongoing management.
Yeah, definitely. I have a question from Carrie. She says, I hear many gardeners complain about plants not being able to survive near black walnut trees. Are most native species tolerant of black walnut since they're more likely to have co-evolved with them?
A lot of native species are quite tolerant of black walnut. Like a lot of people, they want to grow tomatoes beside black walnut, but that's not going to happen. But if you look at what sort of systems black walnut naturally grows in, you can kind of try to emulate the species there. So you can think of like kind of like open woodlands, or you can think of like moist bottomlands or floodplains. And so try to like go into your local natural area, look at the native plants and reflect on what's growing there. So you can actually have a lot of different aster species, goldenrod species, even wild bergamot. It will grow fine around walnut. You can also have lots of spring ephemerals and shrubs. So like almost all of our woodland shrubs and woodland edge shrubs are tolerant of black walnut and can have some really good function within a cultivated landscape.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Thanks. Speaking of asters, where to go here? Sandy wants to know if there's any cultivars of New England that we have to be careful
of. Okay. New England asters are tricky because they are absolutely fantastic in their diversity, and asters in general are they have high plasticity and phenotypic variation, which means that they can have a lot of variation. So New England asters, they can have natural color morphs ranging from white to pink to light purple to dark purple. And so it can make it a little bit more challenging to differentiate natural variation from cultivars. But if you're buying it from a plant nursery, cultivars are going to have the scientific name followed by a name that's in quotation marks. And so that will be kind of your giveaway. But in cultivars are a little bit controversial. But in general, if they are not altering the leaf color, or if they're not causing plants to have double blooms, they are not extremely harmful. They still provide some form of benefit. And if you are trying to find some sort of transition and you are fairly new to native plants, they're a really good stepping stone. And I don't want to exclude people from native plants just because of being like, oh, cultivars. When some cultivars are they're just the result of people propagating plants for like vegetatively and just repeating it over and over. Some of them are just simply that rather than the result of hybridization. So it's like there's a lot of nuance in there.
I think that's a great answer. Definitely nuance is an important way to describe that. Um, I just have one last question for you. Payton, it's from Sandy. She asks, what is the best to oversee dog strangling vine? We are working on cutting it back, but cannot mow or till as it is in a city park. Evening primrose, asters, milkweed, and there's a follow-up. What milkweed would grow on a steep hill?
Dog strangling vines, really tricky. I honestly would contact your city and see if you can get some form of, if you can get permission to cut. That one I haven't had a lot of experience with. Restoring an area with dog strangling vine, it's a very complicated plant to deal with, partially because of how dense it grows. And so I definitely recommend contacting the city and then also looking at Ontario native plants, Ontario Invasive Plant Council, my apologies, and Ontario Invasive Plant Council, and looking at their best management practices for dog strangling vine to see what sort of management that you can do. And again, get permission from the city and try to coordinate work with them, because this is actually a regulated species at the provincial level through the Invasive Species Act. And so if you bring it up to them, they are sort of obligated to actually come up with some form of plan. And if you're willing to volunteer and work with them, you're going to have a lot more mileage in that. And I see what sort of milkweed would grow on a steep hill. How steep, I guess. Is it like very erosive? Is it like sandy? Is it clay? Because like I haven't seen swamp milkweed on hills, so we can just like cut that one out. But I have seen the butterfly milkweed, the orange one. Yeah, I have seen that one grow on some hills, and same with like your common milkweed. Lots of asters and goldenrods on steep hills, actually.
Yeah, I think the response there, Sandy said very steep clay.
Okay. Yeah, not fully sure. Yeah, common milkweed would be my best guess, but realistically, I'd just go for something that's not milkweed and just a different sort of variety pack of seed mixes.
There was a note here about putting milkweed near dog strangling vine and its ability to confuse monarchs. Is that something you can touch on?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that is a very important consideration. So one of the threats and the impacts of dog strangling vine is that monarchs, it's in the same family as milkweed, as Schleppiaceae. And so monarchs will actually confuse it for milkweed. And so when they lay their eggs on the dog strangling vine, the eggs will hatch. And actually, when working in Prince Edward County, saw some caterpillars on dog strangling vine that were trying to eat it and just that they can't eat it. They can't survive that. And so, if don't put it directly beside it, keep a good buffer in it and keep an eye out on the DSV for any sort of eggs or larva caterpillars and move it over to milkweed. Don't plant them too close.
Thanks for that clarification. I didn't know too much about that, so it's good to know. I just have one question before we close out. Something that's been really popular in education and in getting youth involved in seeds and restoration through seeds has been something along the lines of seed bombs or guerrilla gardening, where people are putting together these seed bombs and spreading them throughout various places. Is this something that, like, do you think this is beneficial? Do you think this is something that people should continue doing? And if so, what are some good species to do that with?
That's going to completely depend on what the species composition is. If you're doing, let's say that you're in the middle of London and you have a lot of cup plant in your mix, it's not going to be ideal because cup plant's quite aggressive and its native range is restricted farther down along the Thames. But and same with like purple coneflower, like that's not exactly native to this region. But if you're keeping an eye out on like what is naturally growing in your nearby ecosystems and collecting from local wild plants with permission and distributing the seeds from those local wild plants, I think it could be fine to put in degraded natural areas that are in like urban areas. But I wouldn't want to order plants online to distribute in those natural areas. Definitely want to try to be as reflective as possible of the natural systems around you when doing that. And so one resource that you can actually look at is the vascular plants of, no, not vascular, what is it? Oh, it is vascular plants of the Carolinian zone by Mike Oldham. And so this was a resource published in 2017. It gives you a list of plants, whether or not they're native or introduced, it tells you, and it shows you in your county, at the county level, for if this plant is common or if it's rare or so forth. And ideally for those native plants, for if you're doing any sort of guerrilla garden, go for things that are common at your county level, just so then you can really support the environment and reflect the local conditions.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I think we've gone a little bit over time. I appreciate you being here today, and I want to thank you for the important work that you're doing and for being able to be here and share some of that with us. So I just wanted to say to everyone before we head out that there is another webinar next week that we're continuing this series with. We're hosting Colleen Cirillo from the David Suzuki Foundation, working on the Butterfly Way project. So very much continuing this conversation on our local green space, on gardening and whatnot. I want to thank everyone for being here today, for participating, and we're really happy to all be learning with you. So thank you to everyone, and thanks to you, Payton, again. It was amazing to hear your presentation today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone who is participating here. It's really great to see.
All right, I think